The chandeliers at the grand hat poured light like accusation. Crystal dripped down from the ceiling, each facet throwing back 1,000 polite reflections. The orchestra began a waltz, old-fashioned and perfect, and the room angled its judgment toward Rafael Mancini, as if the music itself had conspired to make him smaller. He stood by the marble wall with a whiskey glass between two long fingers. The drink was meaningless. The suit fit, the silk tie lay flat against his chest. The name Mancini had once opened doors. Now it closed them. Men who had once laughed with him leaned into small groups and turned their shoulders. Women smoothed their skirts and offered the same rehearsed smile that said no without cruelty, because cruelty would have been too direct. Laughter rolled along the edges of the room like a current, polite and precise. Rafael heard each rejection as if it were a physical blow. A hand lifted in the air, an invitation, and fell away. Conversations diluted, eyes flicked. Bruno Cavalcante watched from the far end, with the privilege of being allowed to smirk. He had the look of a man who tracks weakness for sport. Some nights you could tell the shape of a life by how people stepped around it. Tonight they circled Rafael like a puddle no one wanted to soil their shoes in. He remembered how it felt to walk into a room and have it bend toward him. He remembered his father's hand on his shoulder, the small lessons of posture and threat. Those things had been inherited with the name. The other parts, jealousy, paranoia, the conviction that brute visibility would keep them safe, had come later, grafted in like a bad root. Then she crossed the floor. Isabella Carvalho moved through the ballroom as if she belonged to a different tempo. She was not of the set, an architect used to breathe in the geometry of old buildings, not the choreography of receptions. A friend had dragged her to the gala as a favor. She had come wearing a simple green dress that did not demand attention so much as accept light. She had the look of someone who believed in quiet fixes, the restoration of facades, the repair of things that still held bones of beauty. She saw the arc of Rafael being avoided before she understood why. It was one of those small, domestic cruelties people perform for amusement, an act of social cleanliness that leaves a man standing alone with his shame on display. She sat on the rim of a laugh, felt it sour, and then stood. Nobody wanted to dance with him, until she crossed the floor. Her hand extended with a certainty that had nothing to do with pity. Rafael looked at her as if he had been pulled from a dream. For a long second, the orchestra was a flood behind them. He saw the lines of her wrist, the way her fingers softened in invitation. It was an ordinary gesture that felt radical in that room, human contact, offered without barter. He almost refused out of habit. Refusal sometimes protects you from expectations. Then his hand closed around hers, and the glass slid unnoticed to the floor. The whiskey emptied into 1,000 reflections. The waltz carried them. The room held its breath. She did not speak of names. She asked nothing of his past. She only asked, with the weight of a normal human courtesy, if he could keep the tempo. He could. For 3 measures, he could be simply a man learning to move again. They left the ballroom silently when the waltz softened. Outside, the São Paulo air felt like something honest, damp, and smelling faintly of rain and car exhaust. Isabella stepped away and said, straightforward, "You look like you've been through a lot." Rafael wanted to say, "Keep your distance." He said instead, "So do you." Her laugh was small. We can both pretend otherwise. They traded numbers the way people do, who sense fragility in the other and don't want to formalize it too soon. He sent flowers the next day. Not roses. He remembered the detail because it mattered. Black orchids, the impossible bloom he had seen once in a private collection. They arrived at her studio, wrapped in plain paper, and she kept one in a jar on the drafting table. Black orchids were a contradiction, exotic but fragile. It suited them. If you like character-driven, true-to-life dramas, like and subscribe. Their first dinner was in a trattoria in Villa Maddalena, at a tiny table that strained under the weight of too many stories. The lighting was warm and necessary. Around them, the world moved in the honest tempo of people who earned their bread. He watched her hands sketching the corner of a building in the margin of a napkin. She spoke of restoration and the stubborn way old houses held memory. He spoke in short sentences, revealing craft in the pauses. There was a caution in him, a sense that whoever listened too long might pull at a loose thread and find the whole garment gone. "You carry something heavy," she said, halfway through a meal of pasta and red wine. She had learned a surgeon's ability to watch someone's face and name the ache. He set his fork down and said, "I inherited a name that doesn't let me be ordinary." "Does it demand more than that?" she asked. He considered the walls his family had built, against police, against rivals, against the city itself. He considered the cost. "Sometimes, yes. Sometimes it's just a memory." There was no grand confession that night. The truth revealed itself in small, crucial ways. A guarded phone that vibrated with messages and a gaze that scanned exits. She asked once about his brother, Mateus, and he softened. Mateus was younger, a medical student with stubborn idealism and the look of someone whose moral compass had not yet been frayed by the world. Rafael's voice took on a protective tone that surprised him. "He's everything I'd give to keep safe," he said. Isabella did not pity him. She listened and laid her own life out plainly. The apartment she helped her grandmother repair, Donna Teresa's fidelity to small rituals, the kind of meals that lasted too long because the conversation was worth it. She did not tell him to change. She did not tell him to confess. She kept asking instead whether choices could be made differently. They moved through the city in a montage of small intimacies. Afternoons at his apartment, where she traced the scars on the furniture. Nights at a record store where a dusty MPB album played, and someone else's sadness seemed to translate into a soft consolation. They exchanged texts in the middle of the night, small bearing that slowly became trust. The black orchid on her drafting table wilted and was replaced. The marble wall image remained a private joke between them. The wall where he had stood during the gala, it became, in time, less a prison than a story he told himself when he felt the world slip toward the old ways. But proximity had consequences. The city's undercurrent of menace does not respect privacy. Men appeared at odd hours. A slicer of the old order reached out with a photograph one morning. Isabella in her office, back turned, sunlight on her shoulder. The image arrived with a message that had no punctuation. "We can make this public." Rafael's chest tightened, the way breath does when you are underwater. The photograph was not a threat of immediate violence. Bruno knew better than to be crude. But the implication was precise. He had enemies who read fear like an open book. They knew the quickest way to make a man act was to put his loved ones on the line. He considered the old answers. Call men, call guns, call favors. There was muscle in the family's past for exactly this kind of problem. If he used those means, he would become the certainty he kept escaping from. Isabella had already shown him a different idea. Small acts of courage could redirect a life. Rafael made a plan that required no gun. It required information, which is a quieter kind of violence. He went to Dr. Helio Braga for counsel. Helio had been the family lawyer since before Rafael could remember. He moved with the economy of someone who had seen too many moral shapes. He listened to Rafael's outline without surprise, and then said, "You will need layers." Layers, in Helio's framing, meant safety nets and exposure at once. It meant preparing documents, verifying transactions, and having a chain of custody for the files that would protect Rafael from double-cross. It meant creating a plausible negotiation where information could be used as leverage, not as a weapon to destroy. Helio knew the law and the thin places where it could intersect with a man's will to survive. They prepared. Rafael pulled files he had kept like secret seeds, ledgers, call records, photographs, bank transfers, things that connected the family to networks best left buried. He sanitized them, duplicated them, and memorized the parts that mattered. They built an architecture of disclosure. Give enough to force Bruno to retreat, but not so much that it would bring down innocents who had nothing to do with the business. It was strategy rather than vengeance. On the night of the warehouse meeting, they staged everything with the hyperliteral care of people who had to account for every possibility. The warehouse sat by the river where the salt air smelled of iron. It was cold and fogged, the sodium lights making halos in the mist. Cars lined up like watchful beasts. Raphael's hands were steady. His suit was dark against the sodium light. Bruno arrived with his own entourage. Men with coats, faces half hidden. He had the look of someone who believed in punishment as theatre. Rafael set the files down on a wooden crate and laid the terms plainly. He wanted two things: that Bruno stop threatening his family, and that the old gestures of unilateral violence towards innocents end. He did not want to start a war, he wanted boundaries. Bruno laughed, a sound like a closing gate. You think a pile of paper. What can it do? It can ruin reputations, but reputations rebuild. Rafael did not rise to the bait. He opened his phone and tapped a few keys. In the nearby car, Dr. Helio watched a screen and confirmed a line of distribution. Rafael had prepared for betrayal. The files were set to be simultaneously uploaded to several secure journalists, a federal contact, and an encrypted network, unless Bruno agreed in the next 45 minutes to leave Mateus and Isabella alone, to withdraw certain claims, and to limit public slander. The power of the files was not immediate shock. It was a slow-turning engine. Each document had its own weight. A ledger with transfers to shell companies, an account that touched a politician's campaign, an invoice signed in a ghost's name. Rafael did not dislike the exposure. He disliked that it might harm the innocent. He made sure the files targeted the machinery that protected violent men, not the community that paid the bills and had nothing to do with the past. Bruno leaned in, the menace in his eyes softening into calculation. "Turn them over," he spat. "Give me the originals." Rafael placed his hand flat on the crate. "I will give you nothing that I can't give to someone else at the same time." He spoke with a calmness that surprised even himself. "But I will give you a choice. Walk away, and I will keep these to myself. Threaten my family, and I distribute. No blood, no spectacle, only consequences." Helio's phone had a direct line to an agent he had worked with in the past. The agent had agreed to receive the files, but not to act until Rafael and Helio had given them reason. There was legal cover, a chain of custody, and a plausible story for the federal police to pursue without seeming like a revenge plot. It was messy and slow, and perfectly within the shrouded corners of what the law allows. They waited. The fog settled on the crates like a veil. There was no violence that night, only a negotiation of teeth and temper. Bruno's power depended on fear, and for once, Raphael's defiance refused to be cowed. The banality of information had become a weapon more precise than any bullet. Bruno left with a threat that was legal in tone and brutal in content. This isn't over. But the word had less teeth now. The files had been prepared. The car with Helio's lawyer sat idling on the far dock, and the agent's contact blinked like a distant promise. The aftermath was not cinematic in the way people expect. There were no triumphant banners. The first thing that happened was exposure. Newspapers that had smelled rumors now had receipts. Headlines named companies. Headlines named transactions. The public found it easier to believe scandal than to stop asking for detail. Overnight, the Mancini name became a headline the way a wound becomes a bruise. The family's assets were frozen pending investigation. Phone calls that had once moved mountains now echoed into voicemail. Rafael expected isolation. Instead, he found a complex solitude. Friends who stayed and friends who left, colleagues who called with legal advice, and the inevitable traitors who sniffed opportunity. Mateus folded inward with a disgust and fear that came from discovering the shape of their family. Rafael sat by his brother's bedside in the hospital after Mateus collapsed from exhaustion. He read the look on the young man's face and felt an ache that did not fade. Cooperating with the police came at a price. Helio negotiated a plea arrangement that would require Rafael to provide testimony and documents in exchange for a reduction in his potential sentence. It was not mercy. It was a ledger of exchange. Truth for leniency. The federal police wanted names, dates, bank accounts. They wanted the infrastructure boasted about in the press. Rafael handed it over in pieces, with Helio guarding procedural integrity as if it were a delicate artifact. He gave them enough to bring down managers and middlemen. He withheld nothing, because withholding would be a betrayal of the choice he had made. To stop the cycle. The media fed on fragments. Courtroom scenes condensed into sound bites. Headlines focused on the spectacle. Photographs of Rafael in the courthouse, a man in a suit whose face had been rearranged by public shame. He was not the villain the press declared him to be, and he was not the hero he wished to be. He was a man who had chosen to trade a legacy of violence for a long, uncertain road. Isabella's presence complicated the public image. Some outlets delighted in peacocking her as the woman who had turned a mobster soft. Others implied she had been naive. She received her share of suspicious messages, some of which threatened her grandmother. She sat with Donna Teresa on the stoop of their apartment and let the old woman make tea and ask few questions. "You knew what you were doing," Teresa said once, and did not ask for more. Her judgment came down as a simple weight. Enough. Isabella did not romanticize Rafael. She watched him file documents in lawyers' offices and watched him deny himself the easy violence that had been his family's first language. She understood that love for him would mean staying while the world tested him. Staying was not a sacrifice. It was a decision made of daily acts. When Mateus wavered and threatened to cut contact, Rafael appealed to him in a way only a brother could, and Isabella supported those attempts by offering no platitudes, only practical care. She accompanied Mateus to a counselor in a nearby clinic, brought him food between shifts, and refused to let the family dissolve entirely. The legal process moved like molasses, deliberate and grinding. Hearings were scheduled and rescheduled, accounts were audited, transactions were traced through a maze of shell companies. There were moments of humiliation, the press following his car, the old friends who would not answer calls, but also moments of fragile respect. Federal agents who told him in private that his cooperation had saved lives by dismantling networks that funded violence. The truth tastes complicated. It can be poison and antidote in the same mouth. There was a night when Rafael sat alone on the rooftop of his building and realized he had been living in a closet of habits. The city unfurled below like a map he still had not learned to read without the Mancini grid. He thought of the black orchid in the studio, now replaced by a potted plant that ate light more patiently. He thought of Isabella sleeping in the apartment, and of how her hand fit in his, and how often he felt like a man rehearsing a different self. He promised himself to try. Time does the heavy lifting of redemption. It does not grant absolution. It hands you a ledger and says, "Settle it." Over the next 2 years, there were accruals and losses. Assets were sold off to pay fines. Mansions that had once been banners of influence were liquidated. Some friends who had been useful vanished. He never stopped wearing the memory of his father's disappointed mouth like a bruise. He also began something new, a small construction company focused on historic restoration. It was his and Isabella's, built from honest contracts and community work. They renovated facades in neighborhoods that had stories to tell. The company's logo was modest. They used the money to pay judges and fines, to compensate victims, and to fund Mateus's medical residency. It was not a return to glory. It was a reorientation of purpose. Mateus finished medical school with a thesis about public health in underfunded communities. He walked across a stage that felt like the only thing Rafael had ever wanted him to do. Rafael watched from the crowd, hands folded, and saw the look in his brother's eyes, the same stubborn idealism that had once made their father proud. The brothers rebuilt something in the quiet ways people rebuild houses, nail by nail, conversation by conversation. Dom Enzo Mancini's fate changed as well. In exchange for Rafael's cooperation, and to the extent that the judges found the testimony valuable, his father's sentence was reviewed. It shortened, not by miracle, but by negotiation and the legal system's mechanisms. When the parole hearing happened, the room smelled of old wood and legal paper. The father and son spoke without grand absolution. There were apologies and silences thinly stitched with small reconciliations. The family reconfigured itself, less as a machine of influence and more as a collection of people who had to find new ways to be together. Dom Enzo left prison with a limp and a humility that had not been there before. He and Rafael exchanged few words at first. Those that they did meant more because of how few there were. Isabella's grandmother, Donna Teresa, gave a small blessing the night Rafael asked for permission to marry her granddaughter. She did not make a spectacle. She gave them a simple meal in the countryside, a ring wrapped in a serviette, and a look that measured the man by the steadiness of his hand. "You have grown tired of the old way," she said. "That will do." Her blessing was not a coronation. It was a commissioning to keep choosing the hard right. Their wedding was a modest affair in the countryside, the kind of gathering that celebrated the sound of voices rather than the shine of glass. Friends came, including some people who had been suspicious at first, and who now saw the slow transformation with a hardened respect that came from watching consequences draw lines in the sand. Mateus stood by Rafael's side, not as an extension of the old family machine, but as a brother who had seen pain and chosen to belong to someone who tried to change. Years folded into each other. The construction company took on projects restoring old schools, and a community center burned years before. Rafael learned to sign checks with hands that no longer trembled with guilt. He learned to sleep without the itch of old habits. Isabella's designs began to be featured in small magazines that had little influence but meant a great deal to their community. She insisted they hire local craftsmen, pay fair wages, and consult with residents. They were not wealthy in the way the name had once promised. They were rich in a different currency, the slow, steady accumulation of trust. Children came, first a daughter named Teresa, and then a son named Enzo. Rafael held Teresa the first night she slept, and felt something in him that was both tender and fearful. He had always known the world could be cruel to the children of men like him. He resolved not to pass down the inheritance of violence. He taught his children how to fix a loose door hinge and how to sit at a table and listen. He told them small stories about the city, always careful about the shape of his own involvement. He taught them to respect dignity, not to seek it through force. Life was not a clean line. There were runs in their plans, a newspaper that printed an old rumor, a bureaucratic snag that threatened the permits for a restoration project, a night of bad dreams where Rafael saw rows of doors he could not open. But the image of him leaning against the marble wall at the Grand Hat was a compass rather than a prison. He would sometimes tell the story at dinner, not as a boast, but as a confession of how fragile dignity could be, and how courageous the smallest acts sometimes were. On the porch of their modest house years later, Rafael sat with his daughter asleep in his arms. The light hit the wood railing, the way chandeliers once had hit the crystal, but gentler. The sounds around their street were domestic. A neighbor's radio singing MPB in a wavering instrumental, a dog barking in the distance, a child learning to ride a bicycle. A warm breeze moved over the porch and lifted the hem of Isabella's dress as she stood at the sink inside, humming a tune Rafael had come to love. He thought of that night when nobody wanted to dance with him. He thought of the small, ordinary courage that had reached across a crowded room and changed the map of his life. It was not that he was saved by her alone. It was that someone, unremarkable, decisive, had refused to make him small in public, and by doing so offered him a corridor to choose differently. In his pocket was a photograph, slightly worn, a black orchid, the one that had arrived at Isabella's studio, intact. He kept it because objects are stubborn like that. They hold memory better than intention. There were still ripples, the occasional man from the old world making noise, the ghosts that returned to test the repairs. Rafael met them not with guns, but with documents and lawyers, and when necessary with the courtroom. He could never erase the past. He could only spend his life trying to set it right. On a weekday afternoon, Isabella found him on the porch and sat beside him. They watched their daughter sleep on his chest. The marble wall belonged to another time. The porch was an ordinary geometry of comfortable boards and paint that needed touching up. It was, he realized, a home rebuilt from fragments of a life that had almost chosen one route forever. "Do you ever think about leaving everything and going somewhere else?" he asked quietly. Isabella turned and looked at him. Her eyes had the patience of someone who had learned to build things that last. "I used to think change came from running," she said. "Now I think it comes from staying and making something honest out of what you have." He smiled. The city hummed around them, not redeeming, not judging, merely continuing. Rafael felt his name shift in the world from a brand of fear to a story with edges. He did not know if history would remember him kindly. He did not expect it to. He only hoped his children would know him as a father who had chosen to be smaller in act and larger in love. The single gesture that changed him, her crossing the floor, was both simple and infinite. There was nothing cinematic about its mechanics. One hand, an extended palm, a choice that could have been shrugged away. But it had been enough. It had opened a corridor he could walk through if he chose to do the work. He stood a little straighter now, not to demand room, but because the work mattered. Somewhere the files he had given were still being examined by people who had no interest in his redemption. Laws were being enforced. Men were being held to account. The city kept its ledger, and on the porch, with small repairs and the sound of MPB drifting from the kitchen, a family breathed. Outside the city, in a modest country house, Donna Teresa pressed her hands together at times and muttered old blessings. She had not been naive to hope. She had simply been patient. Rafael and Isabella's wedding portrait hung in her living room like a proof that people could change, if only because they chose, day after day, to be better than their pasts. When Rafael thought of Bruno now, he felt no longing for revenge. He felt the cool satisfaction that comes from knowing a difficult negotiation had preserved the lives of innocent people. Information had been a chastening weapon. It had cost him his name's easy power, but it had spared the things that mattered: his brother, his wife, his children. He continued to restore facades and to listen to Isabella's complaints about the new plans. He learned to ask for help. He learned to be accountable. He learned to sit with regret without letting it calcify into the old defenses. He relearned enjoyment in small things, the way sunlight pooled on a kitchen counter, the cadence of his daughter's sleep, the smell of black orchids when a new bud opened. Years later, when he walked past the marble wall on a warm evening, now a smaller man, a man with calluses on his hands from honest labor, he no longer felt the weight of a name as a suit. He felt the weight of responsibility. He touched the cool stone with a finger and then walked on toward the porch where his children were playing. The city gave no parades. It offered only moments. He took them. He kept counting them. If this story stayed with you, tell someone about it. Share which moment moved you most. And if you want another story like this, watch the next video. There are more lives to be examined and more small acts that change fate.